Greetings, everyone, and thank you for showing up on this beautiful day when you might rather be out on the water or on the golf course or doing something else. But it's flattering that you are here. And I have been looking forward to this for some time. And it's been it's been 2 years since this book was published, 2021, by Johns Hopkins. And at that time, you'll remember, there were very few public presentations. Johns Hopkins did not offer book talks. They did not subsidize anything like that. And so this has been a long delayed book talk for as far as I am concerned, because the audiences just weren't there. Nobody wanted to show up in the age of COVID, which I hope is over. We'll see. And anyway, the War of 1812 is something that I've been studying for a long time, but a lot of people haven't. And so I thought that this also might be an opportunity to dredge it up from the past, as it were, and kind of screen out some of the elements that may not be, vitally important to the Navy. But this talk will be formed, in the most part, about the Navy and its performance, and how it performed, and how well it did, and also how poorly it did in some areas. And so I want to make sure you understand that this is not going to be, homage to the Navy necessarily. We'll also discuss at the end, we'll have some minutes set aside for discussion, questions that you may have had. Now, all your long lives, that haven't been answered about the War of 1812. But I have one or two questions for you. So, you signed up for this course. Presumably, you might want to know something about it, or you know a lot about it. And you just want to get confirmation of certain things that you recall hearing. But let me ask you, what is it that comes to your mind first when you hear War of 1812?
Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry?
Fort McHenry.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Battle of New Orleans.
Speak up.
Battle of New Orleans.
Battle of New Orleans. Oh, I never heard of that. Is there some reason that comes up in your mind?
Well, battle was after the war. It had already been, peace had already been agreed to.
That's true. That's true. That's a good point there. Anyone else?
Clipper ships out sailing the British Navy.
Oh, our ships out sailing the British Navy. Yes. Well, they weren't quite clipper ships yet. That came later, but these were from very good ships and frigates. And then I recall talking with my wife about, there was another reason that people might remember the War of 1812. Do you remember our conversation about that?
Sure I do. Was that the connection to St. Michael's? Or was it the song by Johnny Horton? Did you want me to do the song?
Now, how many of you remember the song? Oh, okay. Well, we won't go in. You want to say the first stanza?
Okay. Now,
No, you don't.
it's your wish.
All right, well, in that case, I'll read it to you. Okay, how is it? In 1814, we took a little trip along the Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little of bacon and we took a little of beans and we fought the bloody British in the Battle of New Orleans. The town, and then you go on. We fired our guns and the British kept a coming and there wasn't nigh as many there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we looked down the river and we'd see the British come, and there must have been 100 of them beating on a drum. They stepped so high and they made the bugles ring. We stood by our cotton bales and couldn't say a thing. And it goes on. Well, I can't stop there, can I? Oh, Hickory said we could take them by surprise. We didn't fire our muskets until we looked them in the eyes. We held our fire until we'd see their faces well. Then we opened up with squirrel guns and really gave them.
Wow.
Oh, I get to swear.
Yeah, they ran through the fires, and they ran through the brambles, and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit wouldn't go.
That's so fun.
They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We fired our cannon till the barrel melted down. So we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled its head with cannonballs and powdered his behind. And when we took the powder off, it gave him lost his mind. I think you have enough of that. No, that, one of those verses exists. So that is
Okay, so
a very popular reason to talk about it for the well.
So I just need to remind all of you, it's going to be easy to hear something and chitter chatter about it, but the minute you start talking, people in Zoom will not be able to hear a word because it'll all be gobbledygook. Okay, so just try not to talk. We have one person talking.
Okay. So we'll go ahead for this. When we talk about the War of 1812, people that seriously think about it say this was an existential challenge for the United States. Like, existential challenge does not mean it's an exercise in existential philosophy about American movement. It means a threat to the very existence of the country. Now, there are some people who feel this was a second war of independence, and there's a division of opinion about that. Whether if we hadn't fought the war, we'd still be independent, or having fought the war, we managed to retain our independence. Is that it? So what is it that really brought this war about? And there's many of reasons that has been advanced. Some people think that the experience of fighting Britain 40 years before had created animosity so great with Britain that we wanted to take part of Canada and add it to the United States. There was a part of the country that didn't want war at all. And that was New England. It was New England, and at some point late in the war, there was a threat that the New England states might split off, declare themselves seceded from the Union, and become a province of Great Britain, once again. Well, there are some who really did want that to happen. But here we are in 1812, about to fight a war with the most mighty navy in the world. They had over 500 vessels of all types. We had perhaps 16 warfighting vessels. But remember what had happened in Europe. And what had happened was the French Revolution, number one. Number two, the crowned heads of the monarchies of Europe saw what was coming, and with the revolution in Paris and spreading further south, and then the beheading of the king and queen of France, it looked to them like it was a true revolution, which could spread to their countries, to their dynasties. So they saw that as an existential threat. And this includes Great Britain, as well as the other crowned heads of the Habsburg monarchy and other princelings in Germany of small states. And so what happened was the formation of a coalition by 1790. My dates are getting mixed up here. 1791, there was a beginning of a coalition of war between these fountains of Europe and France, which lasted on nearly 20 years, and 20-year war. And Britain already had perhaps overextended itself with its worldwide empire and basically trying to finance its existence and carrying on with us having to recover from the American Revolution, which cost Britain dearly and France even more. And so what has happened here is that the foundling United States, a young nation, had tried to now create a government out of whole cloth. I mean, this was all experimental, you understand, and we still call it an experiment, don't we? We feel threatened today by certain development in the country, which seems to be undermining the very democracy that revolution and the War of 1812 created and helped sustain. So, trade was suffering during the War of the Coalition. And we were making money ourselves off the fact that we were a neutral nation, as is said, established by John Adams when he was president. So here's a neutral nation trying to trade with France on the one hand and the French West Indies, and Britain with the British West Indies. And both of those monarchies had a closed system. They didn't want us to interfere in their trade, especially at wartime. And so it happened that France was angry with us for trading with the British. And then one more step was that the United States then in 1794 created an understanding with Britain that it would trade with Britain and not with the French. This angered the French because they had fought in the American Revolution with the young United States against the British. And so, all of a sudden, 1795, 1796, the French began to take our merchant vessels in the French West Indies and in the Mediterranean and Europe. And this was a serious blow at our dignity, at our sovereignty. At the same time, the British didn't like the fact that the French were trying to oppose us. We had an understanding with Britain at the time. So, under George Washington's leadership, they decided to create the 6 frigates, the 6 big frigates, which were the beginning of the United States Navy, and also other states independently of the United States, of the government of the United States, offered their own ships, offered to build ships. These ships were called the subscription ships. So you have the Essex, for example, and the General Green, and a dozen other vessels that were created to amplify, that is, to broaden out the U.S. Navy, whose big frigates hadn't quite been built yet. One was the United States, the frigate built, 17 completed, 1797, and the Constellation a year later, the Constitution in the same year. The President frigate was not finished until 1800. The Chesapeake was finished around 1799. The Congress came out in 1799 from Portsmouth. So what was the first thing that the United States had to do to create these first frigates? The original frigates, we had to have Navy yards. We had to have those Navy yards built on government-owned property. It had to be condemned. The Secretary of the Navy, 1798, first Secretary of the Navy was Benjamin Stoddard, and he was the one who authorized the purchase of land in 6 major ports of the United States as centers of the Navy and where the Navy yards would be built, which includes Charleston, Norfolk, not Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Portsmouth. So in each of those places, the U.S. Navy has its Navy yards. And what is necessary for Navy yards to exist? Well, let me go down a list of things. We're going to have, first of all, you've got to have deep water. Secondly, you have to have the necessary machinery, that is primitive machinery, to haul ships out of the water. You have to have the workmen, you have to have the artisans, you have to have all sorts of, what do I call it, logistical equipment. So there's a large list of things that we talk about when we talk about logistics. And this book, is really different from a lot of other books because it's not your typical operational, these ships fought on this day, those ships fought in another day, there were fighting on the lakes, there was fighting in New Orleans, in other words, drum and trumpet history, or captains and ships history. What this book does is to enlighten us on what it takes to have a Navy. What did it take to create the Navy that we're going to talk about? Well, a few things I'm going to say. What are logistics? Well, you see it on the side of a lot of 18-wheelers these days. This truck is for logistics. We believe that you need logistics like this. We are logistics. So I'm surprised that people might say, what the heck is logistics? Unlike someone might say. It's the process by which the administrative and material needs of the Navy were provided in a timely manner, in sufficient quality and quantity, where needed, to ensure successful operations. And this means sustained operations. You know if you're in a war, it's going to last a long time. It's not, you're going to bring the troops home by Christmas. It has to last a long time. So the logistics we're talking about has to be providing everything the ships need and the men in those ships need for a lengthy period of time. You also need leadership. Leadership, competent, experienced leadership. You need to have communications, good communications. Communications means, of course, land transport between ports. Good communications means ship-to-ship communications. How do ships communicate when they're not next to each other? Well, in those days, there were 2 different methods. One is flag hoist, another is signal lanterns. It's signal between ships at sea. Let's move it a little farther. With these communications, it's possible to deceive the enemy as well. This gets into intelligence. Each ship had its own, each navy had its own codes. And each ship had a code book that corresponded to the other ships in its own navy. But what if one of your ships gets captured by the enemy, and the enemy captures your code book? Then they know how you communicate. They would know, let's say, if ship number one has a code assigned to it as 121, and the flags could represent individual figures. At night, you would have a different code for light signals. So if I am in the Constitution and I see a ship coming at night, it's a strange ship, it looks like another frigate, not sure if it's a friend or an enemy, you hoist your 121 signal, which may be 3 lanterns or different in different combinations. If you don't see the corresponding ship's recognition signal, recognition, yes, I recognize you, I'm one of yours. That would be also a signal that if the code books were captured, would be betrayed. I'll give you one example of this, just stepping into the future a little bit. When the Chesapeake was captured by the Shannon off the port of Boston in 1813, this very thing happened. The British captured the ship and defeated the American ship in 15 minutes. That's a very short time. Captain Lawrence died as a result. Well, what they failed to do was drop their code books in a heavy bag, let's say, over the side, sail bag, whatever, and so they would never be found. But the British did, in fact, find the code book. Secretary William Jones understood that right away. As soon as he heard the news of June 1st, 1813, he asked the question, did they destroy their code books? Did they get rid of them? And no one could say. But the assumption was they did capture code books, as well as all the captain's documentation, his orders. The ship was not sunk in the battle, it was there. So the British searched through the ship, got all the papers they needed, got else what they needed. And so Jones then contacted William Bainbridge, who was the superintendent of the Boston Navy Yard. He said, we need a new code book and we need it now. So they put him to work creating a completely new alphabet with all the signals different, rearranged, new flags, different color arrangements for the flags, designs that is. And so then Bainbridge, having completed that task, had his own first lieutenant, which some people would call chief of staff, he was the executive officer of the ship, take copies of these signals around to all commanding of all the naval ships that were in port. And of course, as soon as others came back to port, they would receive this. But for a time, ships that were at sea, our ships, having with the stolen code book in the British hands, they were at risk. So you see, communications are so important. Intelligence is important. That was another element of logistics. It may be obvious, but planning is part of logistics. You need a plan if you're going to fight a war. Well, those who are in charge of the plan at the national level have to have a strategy. The strategy is what we might call grand strategy. Grand strategy is what you do with your resources. If you're in a conflict, if you're in a conflict, you have to know what the enemy's ideas are going to be. What's the likely approach of the enemy going to be like? Are they coming at you by sea, by land, both? And what are you going to create in terms of weapons for this war? You have to consult your resources. You have iron ore, you have timber to build the ships with. You have the men with the experience to be sailors. These are all questions that we ask at the national level. So that's this grand strategy. Then there is operational strategy. Operational strategy is the strategy that you as a commander of a regiment or a brigade or Secretary of the Navy is going to say, in these circumstances, we will do these things. In other words, how are you going to deploy your ships if you are opposed by an enemy squadron? So you say, all right, we will oppose them in two different groups. If they're going to be in a line of battle and coming this way, we will separate our squadron ships into two different groups. And then we will try to divide that line and then fight from within. Or you could design it so your ships are going to surround the enemy if they are not too numerous. That is operational strategy. And then there are tactics at a lower level. And tactics come down to what you as an individual ship captain or a major, a brigade major, or even a captain of a company of troops, how are you going to use your 100 men in that company? How are you going to approach the enemy's strong point here? If you're the ship captain and you see another ship that is an enemy ship and you know there's going to be a battle, how do you arrange what's your theory? How are you going to defeat that ship? But this requires this intelligence. Do you know, for example, how many guns that ship has? How heavy are those guns? How you know the identity of the opposing commanding officer? Do you know which ship that is, in fact? Well, they will probably hide that from you. So these are tactics at the ground level or at the sea level, shall we say. And so you can decide what you are going to do. Let me take another example from James Lawrence. We will cover him in a few minutes. James Lawrence approached the Shannon from the port of Boston. The Shannon was a blockading ship from Halifax. The commanding officer, Shannon, was well known. His name was Broke, Isaac Broke. And he'd been a frigate commander for a number of years of the same ship. He had trained that ship's crew to a fairly well in how to use the big guns. So they used to call them the great guns. These are the guns that would be perhaps 24-pounders, 28-pounders, or 32-pound carronades. So these long guns and these short guns, it's a combination of them all. And so you would need to know that to decide what you were going to do. So I carry the example a little farther. Chesapeake comes out of Boston Harbor, sees the Shannon. They know they're waiting for them. It's a light wind day. The north wind favors the Chesapeake. Shannon's commanding officer has his sails aback. He's waiting for you. he's going to get you if he can. You're in the Chesapeake, and you're going to decide, how am I going to fight this other ship? Am I going to approach him head on? No. Most of the ship's guns are on both sides. Say, for example, you might have 20 guns on a side. So you actually he might have 20 guns on his side. Are you going to approach him alongside to give him a broadside, another naval technical term? Are you going to pass his stern? Are you going to try to confuse him? Now, just to use an example of what actually did happen, Lawrence brought his frigate, Chesapeake, alongside Shannon to have a fair fight. Fair fight. Okay? Well, that would assume certain things. It would assume that you can handle that broadside. It would also be giving up the one true crucial advantage you have before you fight, that you have the advantage of movement. And it is your enemy is standing still. You could maneuver yourself around the stern. Right? Then you fire your guns one at a time as each gun passes the ship, the opposing ship. Boom, 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 like this. And by doing so, you are going to rake the opposite ship's deck. When you rake the deck of a ship, the shot goes straight up from the stern to the bow. It takes out many of the gun crews on one side or the other. It may take out the helmsman. It may take out the captain. And if you're doing this, say, if you have 20 guns, you will, and they're all being used effectively, you have a chance of getting the gun crews on both sides of the masts. So, then what do you do? If the enemy ship is in a shambles, you can wear around, you turn your ship around, and come back and use your port side guns. You've already used your starboard side guns. They're reloaded. They may have damage, they may have something. You wear around and you give him your port side guns in the same manner. This time, broadside. So, if you use your starboard side guns against the stern of the Shannon, you have basically the need to turn and then use your other side, your opposite side guns. Now that's a brief example of a tactic. I'm probably going on too long here. Next is recruitment. Where do sailors come from? Well, most likely, they come from the fishing fleets, or they come from the merchant trade, or they would be privateersmen who are not employed at the time, and you would need them, their experience. But you have to you have to gain their confidence. You have to win their loyalty. So, what they used to do was to open a rendezvous. Well, that sounds sexy. Well, a naval rendezvous is usually held in front of a bar, at a bar, somewhere in the downtown area of a ship, of a port. And what they do is they send a lieutenant or a midshipman and a marine drummer and a fifer. And they would set up a little table perhaps outside the saloon. And the fifer and the drummer, they play patriotic tunes and attract the crowd. And meanwhile, the bartender is busy because the recruiting officer has arranged that if a man signs up, he will get a nice, a healthy drink. And so, bit by bit, you will recruit your crew, even if it takes weeks. And once you do that, you will have a sufficient number of men in your crew. But how many men do you need? That depends on the size of the ship, doesn't it? So let's say if you're a 44-gun frigate, you will need perhaps 300 men. Maybe some of you are already on board. If you are a sloop of war, you may only need 200. If you are a corvette, about 18 to 20 guns, you may only need 150. So all those things bring to bear. So that's all part of logistics. Now, procurement. How do you supply the food, the grub, as they might say, that feed the crew? Well, I have a little quote here I want to use. I went back, I was doing my research, and I found some definitions of what you need to supply a Navy yard and a ship. Now let's go to the ship, because that's what we're talking about now. On a ship, you have a captain, officers, maybe half a dozen officers, maybe more if it's a big ship. You need a purser. A purser is the man in charge of supplying food and drink to all hands. He has an immense responsibility. He's also the paymaster. So what he needs to do, he would go to the supply in the Navy Yard and he would purchase the supplies needed for this, say, 150-man ship. And then the purser, he does it with his own money. He gets refunded by the Navy and charges a 10% commission for the things that he has purchased. In other words, he makes money and the Navy gets its supplies. But he has other responsibilities. Let me quote from Captain Preble's standing orders. These comes from the Navy regulations of 1802. On arrival in port, the purser is to take early measures to supply the ship with fuel and necessities of every sort that last at least until the ship is scheduled to be resupplied. He is required to see that the ship's purser's steward and attendant keep the steward's room, the bread room, and the passageway clean and neatly arranged. The key to the steward's room is to be kept by the first lieutenant or the commanding officer, who will deliver it to the purser from 7 until morning, 7 in the morning until 4, from 4 until 7 in the afternoon, from 7 to 10, from 4 to 7, and at such other times as may be necessary. Upon receiving slops, now slops are not what you think. Slops are what normally they call mariners' clothing. Maybe old shirts, trousers made out of sails, whatever it was required to keep them at least warm and covered. The purser is to examine them carefully for size and quality and report to the captain any that prove to be different in size or quality. The purser is to pay great attention to the instructions directing which of the oldest provisions are to be served first in order to prevent having to do vast surveys because of keeping provisions, especially cheese, over long. No change or alteration, whatever, is to be made in the ship's company provisions without the captain's particular direction. The person is to visit every Saturday the steward's room, the bread room, the slops room, with the master and carpenter to point out any leaks, damp, or injuries his stores may be suffering from those or any other causes. On no account should a selection of choice pieces of beef be taken for the officers when it is cut up for the ship's company. And no choice pieces of salt meat are to be set aside for the officers when they are intended for the whole ship's company. Officers do not select for their own use the best wine or spirits when they are needed for ship's company. One last. The purser is to make immediate notice to the captain on the discovery of any provisions that may be found unwholesome or unfit for men to eat, and to report without delay any instance of any part of the crew that refuses provisions or murmurs at or complain of the quality of these provisions. Now, can you imagine a group of military men not complaining about the food? That's what always happens. But as long as they're not murmuring, sometimes it's all right. So, that said, let me proceed. There's a few details there we haven't covered, and I will cover it soon. Okay, what we have here is the ship United States, frigate United States. It was it launched in 1797, as we said, and by 1812, she's a fairly old ship, but they restore these ships from time to time. They refit them, they replace what needs to be replaced. I love this painting because it shows the ship riding on the downside of a swell. You can feel it. If you see a ship that's on a flat ocean, that doesn't give you the emotion, or the motion, and emotion that the ship is going to give you if you are on board that ship. And so it communicates that. It also communicates the smoke that issues forth from the guns when they are fired, which must be choking, it must be terrible, your vision is obscured. It gives you the atmosphere. The sails are full, and they're pulling from, you can see the starboard quarter. And so this ship is in action, and you can see it's enjoying it. The ship is, that is. Okay. Where does the war in 1812 take place? Well, all along the coastline, but also, and we'll give you a different map soon, along the St. Lawrence, along the Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, to some degree on Lake Huron, not on Lake Michigan. Right here, boys? Okay. Lake Superior, no. Now, inland, there really isn't any British activity inland. It's all along the coast. And except for the Creek Wars, which are in Mississippi, Alabama, that's where that's an interesting subject which we can talk about later. The Creek War in the South does bring the British in terms of their agents, and they're trying to encourage the Indians to fight against the U.S. militia and the federal troops. So we'll move on. This is here President Madison. Now, Madison, the most brilliant man in Congress. He helped draft the Constitution. He did draft the Bill of Rights. He was a brilliant lawyer. But was he a good president? Was he one of the great presidents? That's a question we could raise. Was he a good wartime president? That's a more incisive question. Well, I can present to you a comparison with Jefferson. Jefferson was a stronger man in terms of his will, his ability, his desire to push his policies forward. Madison was more diffident. He is more accepting of pushback. And if there was too much pushback, he just let the issue lie. People criticize him for not being more aggressive, if being more willing to drive or push his party, the Republican Party, into what they needed to do to fight a war. So the war comes in the spring, June, that was in June of 1812, and we are going to see how the Navy handles it. The first sign here is that Paul Hamilton is a man who doesn't demand your attention. If you see the portrait, do you get the idea that this is a man who has great power, who knows how to use it? Or is it a man who looks tired, a little laid back? Well, the fact is, Bill Hamilton was not a naval person. He was not a maritime person. He was chosen by Madison as a loyal Republican from South Carolina. He was a rice planter. Or rather, his slaves were planting rice. He had a rice plantation. Of course, he owned slaves at that time. And he was chosen because he had experience fighting in the American Revolution on land. And he had been governor of South Carolina. So, administrative credentials, yes, he had those. But he didn't have drive, and what he did have, was a love of liquor. And when things got a little tight and stressful in office, he tended to take too much of the drink. And so the story goes that in Washington, he was, after noontime, he wasn't much of a leader. He was more a bon voyant, bon vivant. So that's Hamilton, who loses his place in late 1812 to someone else. This is John Rogers, who was one of the leading, probably the leading officer of the Navy in his time. What do you get from looking in those eyes? What do you think about that personality? I think it communicates. I think he's a hard driving man, and you do not contradict him, and you don't question your orders. That was what he looks like, but that is what he was like. He was a tall, imposing man who will cut you dead if you are at all opposing him. Now, you will not get a gentlemanly conversation out of him if you meet him on the street. Oops, I'm going too far. Too far. Trying to go backwards. That's forward. All right. Sorry about that. So Rogers had command of the USS President. That is one of the big 44 gun frigates. And it fell to him at one point in 1811, that's before the war started, this helped to contribute to the Congo War, which was the incident with the Little Bell. Little Bell was a small sloop of war that the British had taken from the Danes in the battles with the Danes before, of course, in the 1790s. And Little Bell refers to a small island in the Skagerrak, which is between Denmark and Norway. So the Little Bell is a ship he came across in his big 44, but that Little Bell was only a 28 gun sloop of war. Now, why would there be a combat between those two ships? Well, it had been reported that this ship, the Little Bell, was the Guerriere. It was misreported. The Little Bell just happened to be in the wrong time, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he went out, he took his frigate out of the Chesapeake Bay, where he had been anchored, visiting his family, where his family came from north of Baltimore. And he went out and started searching for the Guerriere. And he found you know, in the evening, as sunset occurred and the darkness came, and they saw a small ship in the distance, but it had the same configuration as a frigate. In other words, three masts, square rig, profile like a frigate. And that's the way things are at sea. You're not really sure what you've got there until you get up close. So the Little Bell ended up, so they met at night, and they could see each other from a certain distance, and the cry goes out, "What ship is that?" And the other ship answers, "What ship is that?" And of course, they wouldn't answer each other, and then one ship or another fired, and fired more than once. So when dawn broke, it wasn't a finished battle. When dawn broke, it turns out that the Little Bell is half the size of the 44, half the size. So which occurred, as it happened, it was very embarrassing for Rogers. And the British made fun of him later on. And he was criticized in Congress as well, but not very severely, because after all, Little Bell was a British ship. But it did create bad feelings between the Brits and the American sailors. Now, Constitution. When the war began in June 1812, Rogers had a squadron of ships in Sandy Hook, ready to sail out to attack the British merchant fleet as it passed by on one of its trade routes from the Caribbean to England. But Constitution was late arriving at Sandy Hook. In fact, she never got to Sandy Hook. Constitution was late getting her sea trials, and all of a sudden, what I described to you before occurred. Constitution comes up the New Jersey coast, and she is trying to get to Sandy Hook to see if Rogers is anywhere around. And captains, lookouts identify 4 or 5 ships, large ships, inshore near Egg Harbor. And they can't tell what ships they are. They could be Rogers' squadron. Now, again, we have night coming on, dusk, and another ship approaches. Well, here we are, Rogers' ship, Hull's ship, and Constitution, and this other ship approaching. They exchange signals, but they don't recognize each other. And for a while, the Constitution is in doubt of who that ship is, but who those ships are over there. Well, it turns out it's actually the Guerriere. And the Guerriere finally finds out that the quadrant it's looking for is the one inshore. And so here we are, as day counts, the British squadron understands that Constitution is an American ship. And so all of a sudden thereafter, it's like hounds after a rabbit. And so Constitution has to deploy its ship's boats to tow because the wind is light and they need to have way on in order to get away from this squadron. So this is the way it went for hours and hours, with the ship boats towing and dropping anchor. And here's the key thing about this is they towed ship for a while, but then the suggestion was made on the Constitution, we should kedge, which means you lay an anchor on top of one of the boats and the boats row out, maybe half a mile, depending on how much cable you have. They drop the anchor. The other end of the cable is wrapped around the anchor windlass. Okay? And the sailors on the foredeck go to work around the anchor windlass and turn that cable, wind it up, which they can do faster than the ship's boat's towing. So and the ship has more than one anchor. So this is what happens. You drop one anchor, roll it in, and wind it in, and the other ship's boats carry another anchor out and drop it. And so go on. And so eventually, coming to the chase, the weather closes in, Constitution is able to get away in a rain squall, hides in the clouds, and by the next day, she's gone. And so she has found freedom. And she understands now that this squadron was actually Commodore Brooks' squadron from Halifax, trying to find Rogers. And so it's hide and seek, you see. I mean, they don't know where each squadron doesn't know where the other is. And so Rogers' squadron is out chasing the British merchant fleet, and Brooks' squadron is looking for Rogers' squadron. It's really quite if it was war, it would be amusing. This is Isaac Cole, who was the captain of that Constitution, and who is he's from Connecticut. He's a firm Connecticut Yankee, but he's a Republican, and he's in the Federalist Navy. We'll go on here. So, Constitution now no longer part of the any squadron. She goes out and searches for anything she can find remotely resembling the Guerriere, and they stop fishing boats off the New England coast. They say, "Have you seen this British warship?" And one of them said, "Yes, I saw it 12 hours ago heading south." Okay, well, then the Constitution keeps searching. Well, they finally find each other, and the battle goes on as I have described, just as like the Shannon and Chesapeake. And finally, Constitution overwhelms the Guerriere and leaves the Guerriere's masts are all shot off. They're down. The ship gives up, hauls down its flag, and they surrender in the token surrender. So Hull accepts the surrender. And then what do we do with the other ship? Well, she's of no particular value at this point. We move all the men who are now prisoners, prisoners of war, and anything useful on the deck of that ship. And finally, you blow her up intentionally, and that's what happened to the Guerriere. So now, when you read this book, I hope you will. Some of you will probably see this. We'll talk about it later. In this book, I have chosen to concentrate on the Lakes War first, before I go into the Atlantic Coast War. The fact is, you have a two-front war, a two-front naval war going on. This is the Secretary of the Navy Jones has to face, and he succeeds Hamilton as Secretary of the Navy in the spring of 1813. So here we are. This one map, unfortunately, has too much detail on it. It shows not only 1813, but 1814. But this is what they call the Northern Lakes Theater. And so you'll find this in my book featured first, because in many books, the Northern Lakes take second place. They all go after the frigate war in separate actions off the Atlantic coast until the end of December of 1812. So, but this is where the real action was. On land, American troops tried to invade Canada in 3 different places. at Detroit, at Niagara, which is right there in the middle, Niagara Peninsula, and way up at the north of Lake Champlain, which is extreme right. We got repulsed in each action. Repulsed in each action. We didn't have enough men to carry through. The British had some experience of officers, regular officers, but they also had the Indian allies. And starting from Detroit, William Hull, who had been the governor of the Northwest Territory, had some respect for the Indian warriors, and so perhaps too much, but he didn't have enough soldiers to beat both the British and the Indian allies at Detroit. And he was very worried that there would be a massacre if he didn't surrender. So that was the end of that. He did surrender, and later he was court-martialed for it. He did not. He was pardoned later on. Okay, at Niagara, incompetence reigned. Nobody had the guts to made most of the troops on the Canadian side. It was a rough ride anyway to cross the Niagara River, and some of the militia from New York State refused to leave their state. They said, we're not obligated to fight the foreign territory. So basically, the attack fell apart. And on the far north, or the right wing of the army, they got a late start. It was snowing already, and General Dearborn, who had commanded these troops, attacked one fort just a bit north of Plattsburgh in Canadian territory. They were repulsed and never re-attacked, never came back. So all three armies defeated. But what you have on the Atlantic is more or better news. Chauncey was one of our best commodores on the Northern Lakes. He was in charge of the Navy squadron at Second Harbor, or on Lake Ontario. Jacob Jones is another one of the, lesser known frigate captains we have. He ended up commanding the USS Wasp, which attacked a small British sloop of war called the Frolic. So Wasp Frolic ended up in a very interesting way. He got a late start. He was supposed to join other American ships in the squadron, but he came out, was hit with a storm, but found another ship that had also been damaged in the storm, which was the Frolic, the HMS Frolic. So basically, he had somewhat advantage over a Frolic because he was larger, but he also had a more trained crew. So he defeated the Frolic, only to have a 74-gun ship, HMS Poitiers, came and found the two of them in a shambles, having just fought the battle that the Wasp had won, but the 74-gun ship was able to overwhelm, of course, the Wasp, and that ended up in a defeat for 1812. This is the Wasp Frolic combat here. But I can't show you the Poitiers because they didn't paint it. But at any rate, this is the Wasp Frolic combat that occurred in October 1812. Stephen Decatur is now one of the leading frigate captains of the Navy. He made his name, especially in the Tripolitan War of 1805-1807. He was commanding officer of the United States frigate here, you see in the foreground, defeating the HMS Macedonian And you can see what's happening here. United States has maneuvered herself in the raking position. So she is taking pot shots at the Macedonian and stands off because Decatur has longer and bigger guns and sizable long guns to defeat her. And so Macedonia couldn't touch the United States. The United States made a wreck out of Macedonia and captured her. But then brought the Macedonian home. They gave her a prize rig and sailed her back to Newport. The United States went into New London. So that was a prize ship that was one of the few we were able to really capture without losing it. William Bainbridge, the next well-known frigate captain, had been in merchant sail before he joined the Navy. He's the one who was a commandant at the Boston Navy Yard when Chesapeake met the Shannon. But at this stage, we're going to say that Commodore Bainbridge was able to command the Constitution on a cruise to the south. December 1812, Bainbridge and Lawrence's frigate met off Brazil, the coast of Brazil. Well, the result was going to be like Constitution Guerriere. Much maneuvering, damage was on both ships, but the commanding officer of Java was killed, and was replaced by his first lieutenant, of course. But the Java itself lost its helmsman and helm, and one of the masts went down, and the first lieutenant surrendered the ship. But the damage turned out to be so bad that Java also had to be exploded and sunk. So, in short, that was the brief and successful year of the Navy on the Atlantic coasts. David Porter needs to be mentioned at this point because he was commanding the Essex, which I mentioned earlier, a beautiful frigate, but a small one, a 32-gun frigate. And his arrangement was he would go out and join Bainbridge. He got a light start, however. And when Bainbridge did not show up at the rendezvous, Tristan da Cunha, off the coast of Brazil, Porter said, well, I have my orders, and it says I have discretion to do with my ship what I want. And what he wanted to do was go around the Horn. So he took his ship Essex around the Horn, many months involved, terrible storms, abated, came in on the Chilean coast and reached Valparaiso. Of course, what's going on in Valparaiso, you don't need to get involved in right now, but there was a war going on between the rebels against Spain and the Spanish armies. Anyway, Porter doesn't take part in that. But he does get news that the British whaling fleet is very busy in the North Pacific, gathering the whales, which of course is a value for whale oil and other commodities, and he captures, it destroys really much of the British whaling fleet over the passage of 1813. And then with his prizes, he knows he needs refit. So he goes to the Marquesas Islands and sets up a kind of a camp there for many, many months. And in fact takes part in some of the native wars, which is a totally different story we can get into. And the basic battle for Porter took place in 1814, so we won't be getting into that today. Oh, sorry, that's Essex, just to give you a nice, nice portrait of Essex. This is Jones, who came in to replace Hamilton. Okay, we'll be talking about him in a minute. So Jones becomes the Secretary of the Navy. Why is that important? William Jones knows what he's doing. William Jones is a merchant from Philadelphia. He had, I say merchant, he was a merchant captain. He had a firm in Charleston, even though he's from Philadelphia. He had gone to sea himself before the War of 1812, long before. He was a veteran of the Revolution as a very young man. And when he became available for Secretary of the Navy, he had already served one term in Congress for a Philadelphia district. So he was a person of considerable knowledge, not only of politics, but also of merchant sailing and how ships should be handled. So that's his prime reputation. James Lawrence is a very sad case because I think I'm going to talk a little bit about him. But tell us a little bit about the Tories, the rebels in the American Revolution. Lawrence became a captain after the Tripolitan War in the Mediterranean. And he was given a command that he didn't want. To put it like this, when he came back from his battles off South America, he had defeated one of the prize British smaller frigates off the Guianas, and he actually sank her right there. He couldn't rescue the men, and even some of the known men went down with the ship that was damaged. And so he deserved some time at home. His wife was pregnant. He wanted to be at home for be reunited with his. He brought together with his wife and new baby. So Jones had sympathy for him. He assigned him to command the New York Navy Guard. Well, at some point, the Constitution command became vacant after Bainbridge said it was time for him to go ashore. And Lawrence put in for Constitution's command, but he didn't get it because a more senior captain, Charles Stewart, put in for it, and he got the nod from Jones. So Lawrence was given a command of the Chesapeake, which he hadn't requested. A smaller ship, it's a 38-gun frigate, not a 44-gun frigate, on short notice. And so, having wanted very much to command Constitution, he gets a smaller ship, and within a few days, I'd say a few weeks, maybe 3 weeks, he was given the command in April, May of 1813. He had only 3 weeks to get his crew in shape and get the ship ready for sea. And then what happened? The Broke's ship, Shannon, showed up off the border of Boston. And Broke wanted to challenge, or did challenge, Chesapeake to a ship-on-ship duel. The challenge came ashore by letter, wrote in by a fisherman. It never got to Lawrence. Lawrence wanted so badly to fight the Shannon with the Chesapeake that he put out immediately, fearing that the Shannon was going to depart and go back to Halifax, because she'd been out there quite a lot. Now, I will reiterate the battle I tried to done a few minutes ago, for good reasons. But the question I have, why did Lawrence choose the wrong tactic to fight Shannon? He is a very proud man. He's a bit like Decatur in that respect. He's very patriotic, very proud. Honor above all that, above all characteristics is what this young officer corps believed in. That's one reason there are so many duels later on. So, but why honor? Why at this point? Our theory. Lawrence's father was a Tory. He was born in Burlington, New Jersey. His father was a lawyer and became the mayor of Burlington, New Jersey. When the revolution broke out, New Jersey became a no man's land. New Jersey was an absolute battlefield between Tories and rebels. And no, if you were in a Tory family, you had stood very good chance of having your house burned down, your family imprisoned, or beaten up, and anything could happen. This was a terrible time for New Jersey. It had turned out that the rebels put Burlington Mayor Lawrence in jail. Who else was there at the same time, interestingly? A British officer named John Simcoe. Now, John Simcoe, S-I-M-C-O, was a British officer standing, probably a colonel by this time. And they got to know each other. It was Lawrence's father and Simcoe. And at the end of the revolution, Simcoe was released and made governor of Upper Canada, one of the first governor of Upper Canada. And Lawrence's father, he persuaded Lawrence's father to become a United Empire loyalist and was given a lot of land for his own use. And my theory is, okay, given that what happened to Lawrence's family, Lawrence felt shame. James Lawrence felt shame. He had to make up for this law in the family that he regretted. Of course, he had to live with it. And so he was going to fight this other ship. He was going to reclaim the family's honor on his own. Okay, that's my personal psychological interpretation of James Lawrence. And you may not agree, but when you do some more reading, you may understand that. But it's my theory, not just a generalization about honor being an important quality in the young officer corps. I take that. At any rate, Lawrence suffered for his brashness. Lawrence suffered. All right, then briefly.
You only have 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is by a man named Schacht, a British painter. He does a beautiful job here. I don't take a lot of the subjects. Beautiful job. This is the Chesapeake frigate being led into Halifax to much celebration. The first major frigate to have been defeated by the British Navy, the Royal Navy, since the war began. The 1st of June, 1813, and here it is. And still, there's a special graveyard in Halifax that I have visited of the American prisoners who died there in prison. Canadians very proud of this. And I don't blame them. It was a tough fight, even though it only took 15 minutes. It was a tough fight. And here's the thing. Commander Brooke, Captain Brooke, despite all his heroics and his long reputation for being a superb captain of gunnery in the Navy, He himself led the boarding of the Chesapeake at the head of his crew, but he also paid dearly for it. He was hit a glancing blow by a sword which hit his head, and he was incapacitated for months. He could not get another ship. So in effect, that was the end of his career, even though his reputation was, perfect for the British purposes. I'm going to end here because there's more to say about 1813, but we can cover the ground in our next session. I want to ask any questions that you may have. Yes.
Way back in the beginning of your talk, you talked about raking the deck. And I understand that and some other things I've read, how from either the bow or the stern and you run the balls down the deck. But I thought you said it would incapacitate the guns and the gunners. I thought they were on the deck below, on the gun deck.
Well, it was not a single deck ship, for one thing. A single deck ship would have a gun deck. Let me clarify my statement. Yes, it had a gun deck as well as a spar deck. But the spar deck is the main battery, and the gun deck also is a dangerous battery, but it could also affect the gun deck. In other words, if you have a frigate, most frigates up to the size of a 44 are two decks, and the spar deck is the upper one where the men handle the sails. The gun deck is the next one down, right? And there's no reason why a raking couldn't destroy some of the guns on the gun deck as well. But at any rate, we're talking theory here. You're right that the spar deck would be the one that would be most vulnerable to a raking attack. Anyone else?
What happened to James Lawrence? What happened to James Lawrence?
James Lawrence died of his wounds on the way back to Halifax.
So he's buried.
He was buried first in Halifax, but then he was repatriated and buried later in Trinity Churchyard, New York City, which is a place of honor, a beautiful church. And it was, that was the place. So they did honor him here.
Bill, talk a little about the leadership of the war. You talked about Madison not being the strongest of men as president. Was his lack of leadership, did it harm? Did it enhance, stop the war? Did it help the war? What was his role in actually commanding his lieutenants in the Navy?
Well, right. The witness people would point out is that Madison was a good Secretary of State. He had a fine legal mind. He could negotiate. He was good at that. But he wasn't good at motivating men to do what, other leaders what needed to do, whether it's Congress or anywhere else. But he had good choices on his department heads. After Hamilton, Jones, that's a good choice. After William Eustis, who was the Secretary of the Army in 1812, he selected John Armstrong. Now, John Armstrong was a completely different character from Dr. Eustis. And John Armstrong was a Revolutionary War veteran, Continental Army. He was a New Yorker. He was a Madisonian, New York Madisonian Republican. And that's to distinguish it from the Clintonian Republicans who were more conservative, more like the Federalists, all right? But Armstrong is a New Yorker, he's proud, he's arrogant, he's stubborn, and he's lazy. And he has some of the qualities you want, some of the qualities you want. Well, and some people say, well, maybe a general is best, a top general is best if he is lazy. But if he's smart and he picks the right people, they do the best thing. Well, so Secretary Armstrong and Secretary Navy Jones were able to do enough good that we were able to sustain our troops and sailors through a year and a half war after they came into power. But what goes against, from my point of view, I think others, is that Madison believed in economic coercion. Coercion. In other words, the embargo that Jefferson put in place in 1807 to punish the British, to bring them to a negotiating position, did great harm to U.S. merchants in the seaports. And it did great harm to the fishing fleet. It was counterproductive in that it encouraged trading across the border, smuggling across the New York State border, smuggling across the Maine border, and it was a growing trade, and it was a sensational thing because money was being made by U.S. farmers in the north, and great landowners too were involved in it, at the expense of American troops on the border. In other words, British troops were being fed American beef because of the droves of cattle that went across the borders from New York, New Hampshire, and Maine. And this was a matter of fact, and even the justices of the peace, the judges in position in those places would not condemn a man who was arrested by an officer of the U.S. Army for trading with the enemy. They turned their back on that. And that didn't seem to matter enough to Madison to change his policy. So eventually, though, he had to change it somewhat. So he took off the embargo and set up other systems that allowed traders to do merchants to do some trading with the British and even in the West Indies. What else was going on? The license to trade. The license to trade was a device used by the British to feed their troops in Portugal, where Wellington was fighting the French army in Spain. We haven't get into this, but Napoleon put his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, so now you're the king of Spain, enjoy yourself. So what would happen in Spain as a result was in most of the cities and villages of Spain rose up in revolt. Arriba. They rose up in revolt against this foreign invasion, which was pushed into their country by Napoleon. And Joseph Bonaparte captured Ferdinand VII, king of Spain, put him in a prison-like castle in southern France. So Spain erupted in revolution in many different places, and in Latin America, by the way. So Wellington's army fighting the French in Spain, Portugal. Spain had been the French initially had been successful in pushing Wellington's lines back into Portugal. You may read sometime in your reading is that the lines of Torres Vedras. The lines of Torres Vedras was a rocky, hilly place in Portugal, near the Spanish border. And that's where the British set up a fortified line of cannon and earthworks and so forth to sustain Portugal. In the meantime, how are they going to feed themselves? Well, turned out that the British were pretty clever about it. They offered American merchants license to come through their lines, off the blockade lines, to go to Spain. And this was common knowledge. It was the Boston consul who had the license. He issued licenses to these sea captains so that once they got to the British blockade offshore, the British blockading captain would ask you, "Where's your license? Show me your license." If they had a license, he would say, "Pass." And they did. So this was a practice that was not halted by Madison until the spring of 1814. And finally, so that's the license trade. So these things are going on, the smuggling, the license trade, and because of this economic policy, this financial policy that Madison seemed to insist upon. So, that's a partial answer.
Okay.
Okay.
So, thank
One
you.
question, back, one more?
Just who officially started the war in 1812? Like, who declared war?
Who decided?
Who declared war?
Who
The
declared
Congress
war?
decided.
Why?
Our
Oh,
Congress.
why? Because frankly, they had no choice. They felt they had no choice. And it was a decisive vote. Madison had given them an address that is a speech in writing. He didn't do it personally. He said, these are the issues. You go to war with France, you go to war with England, take your choice here. We've got the British motivating Indians to fight us inland and so forth. The issue was, where is honor? Where is honor? See that word coming up again. They're impressing our sailors. They're taking our sailors. They're seizing our ships. Both the French and the British were doing that. What do we do next? Well, without being prepared at all, Madison had a faith that the United States, as it was, would come through. He had to say, all right, we're now going to have a war. You, Congress, have this final say. If you want war, vote for war. So it wasn't Mr. Madison's war, as some book titles say. Congress declared war. He suggested, by the way, I transfer England, but we've got to have a war here somehow.